Hi, if you haven't listened to the first and second episodes of Force of Law, I suggest you stop now and do that. This episode will make a lot more sense if you hear those stories first. This podcast is brought to you with support from 70 Million.
We don't want no watered down bill. We don't want no watered down bill. We don't want no watered down bill.
About 50 activists showed up at the Capitol on a Monday morning in May 2019. Behind the scenes, politicians were deep in negotiations over a bill to change California's standard for police to use deadly force. The activists were upset that the Democratic governor and legislative leaders had suggested changes to the bill that would make it too friendly to law enforcement. The protesters feared the amendments would negate what they were trying to achieve, a standard that would stop police from unnecessarily killing people. For this group, it's a matter of racial justice, since the majority of people California police kill are Black and brown. Kim McGill of the Youth Justice Coalition rallied the protesters in the hallway outside the governor's office.
We have to demand also the governor stay strong and not push their watered-down version forward, but push AB 392 as is forward. So that's why we're here. So we need to flood this office with calls, flood this office with visits, keep shutting it down until they back our bill instead of a watered-down garbage bill. We don't get it!
Shut it down!
The protesters included many Californians whose relatives have been killed by police, people who have been pushing for a new law for more than a year. The suggested amendments frustrated them, but they maintained confidence in the lawmaker leading the charge for this bill, Democratic Assemblywoman Shirley Weber.
Dr. Weber stood by us, and she's not agreeing to the amendments either. She's standing with our families, with the community that's fighting for this bill to go through on the legislative floor.
That's Lori Valdez of San Jose. Her partner died 5 years ago after he refused to drop a saw blade he was holding, and university police shot him. I asked if she was surprised that Weber was siding with families like hers instead of with political leaders.
No, because she has worked with us. She has heard our pain. She's listening.
It seemed like it could be a huge setback for the bill. If Weber didn't accept the changes, it might mean she wouldn't reach a compromise with law enforcement. And if she didn't reach a compromise, her bill probably wouldn't get enough votes to pass. Even though Democrats have a supermajority in the California legislature, many of them were unlikely to vote for it if law enforcement remained opposed. Was the whole thing falling apart? I went to the Assembly chamber to try to find out and found Weber and an aide walking into the Speaker's office.
I've got to go to a meeting right now.
I just wanted a really quick update on what's going on.
That's where we're going to the meeting right now on that.
Can we talk afterwards?
It depends on what the meeting tells us to do.
I waited outside the Speaker's office for about a half hour until her meeting ended.
Dr. Weber,
We don't have any comments now. We don't have any comments right now.
Are you making amendments?
We don't have any comments right now.
In the legislature, Shirley Weber has been working on this bill for more than a year, persevering through political setbacks and failed attempts at compromise. But beyond her elected office, it's as if Weber has been working toward this bill for her entire life. A sharecropper's daughter who was born in Arkansas, Weber came of age in Los Angeles during the rise of the Black Power movement in the 1960s. She went on to study history and spent decades as a scholar of African American social movements that foreshadowed today's push for greater police accountability. In 2012, voters in San Diego elected Weber to the state legislature. She's taken on powerful political interests that few of her fellow Democrats are willing to cross. Weber clashed with teacher unions as she pushed bills she believed would improve public education. She stood up to police unions as she advanced a measure to curb racial profiling. And now she's facing them again, trying to craft a new law that would limit when California police can use deadly force. That's what we're exploring in this series. I'm Laurel Rosenhall, and this is Force of Law, a podcast about police shootings and California's attempt to do something about them. This episode is about Assemblywoman Shirley Weber and the lawmakers she must convince to help her pass a tougher standard for police to use lethal force.
The Assembly is now in session.
For weeks before the Assembly gavelled in at the end of May, the governor's staff and legislative leaders negotiated privately with law enforcement groups and civil rights advocates. At times, it seemed like they might not get to this moment.
Members, without objection, we are going to move to take up file item 150, AB 392.
By this point, everything had changed. The amendments the activists were so upset about did not make it into the bill. Instead, the negotiations produced a different compromise. Some activists liked it, and others didn't. Black Lives Matter said the legislation had become too weak and withdrew its support. But the American Civil Liberties Union and other civil rights groups were still solidly for it. Law enforcement groups moved from opposition to neutrality, signaling they don't love the bill, but they can live with it. I'll explain the details of the compromise in just a minute. For now, though, the main thing to understand is that it involved some give from both sides, removing a couple paragraphs the police groups couldn't accept while keeping the elements most important to the ACLU. The governor and both legislative leaders signed off on the deal. All that turned the political tides and gave Weber plenty of confidence as she presented the bill to her colleagues on the Assembly floor.
Mr. Speaker and members, I rise to present to you today AB 392, the California Act to Save Lives. This bill seeks to raise California's legal standard for when police can use deadly force to match best practices already in place at some departments and that we know work to keep both officers and public safe. Recent amendments to the bill have clarified its meaning and removed opposition from numerous law enforcement groups.
The bill says police may only use deadly force when necessary in defense of human life, a steeper standard than prosecutors apply now, which says police can shoot when doing so is reasonable. Fundamentally, that's what Weber and the activists behind the bill set out to change. They also won language that says that in evaluating whether a shooting is justified, authorities can consider the conduct of the subject and the officer leading up to the moment the officer decides to shoot. The bill says an officer's fear of potential future harm is not enough to justify using deadly force. The threat must be immediate. These provisions together would take the California standard beyond the baseline set by the United States Supreme Court and would narrow the circumstances when police could legally fire their guns.
This is a 400-year challenge to an African American in this country because of the definition of our lives and the vulnerability of African Americans, whether it was dealing with law enforcement, whether it was dealing with lynch mobs or what it was. It was that whole issue. Our lives are always precarious and could easily be taken without any justice or anyone fighting back.
As part of the compromise, though, the bill lost a paragraph that defined a necessary use of force as one in which there is no reasonable alternative. This was a win for police, who objected to that wording. They said it would encourage prosecutors to second-guess their actions in hindsight and remove the legal protection officers need to make split-second decisions. Instead of defining the word necessary in the body of the bill, that concept now appears in sort of a preamble that spells out lawmakers' intent. And putting it there gives it less power. It means courts can decide on a case-by-case basis what necessary is supposed to mean. Democratic Assemblywoman Sidney Kamlager-Dove acknowledged the bill's limits even as she endorsed it.
It is a game changer in the sense that it is asking us as the state to take responsibility for the fact that so many Black and brown unarmed men are being and have been shot and killed by law enforcement. But the reality is, it's not that much of a game changer because it is still linked to the autonomy that is held by district attorneys' offices across the state.
The compromise also involved removing a paragraph that said officers could be liable for manslaughter if they act with criminal negligence. So under the new version of the bill, officers charged with manslaughter may try to defend themselves by claiming that a shooting was justified. Essentially, it gives them more leeway than the original bill did. That change is one reason Black Lives Matter pulled its support. It's also a reason police stopped their opposition. As the Assembly debated the bill, one lawmaker in particular seemed caught in the tug of war between the two sides. One fighting to stop police from killing, the other fighting to protect police.
I struggle with this bill. I toiled with this bill. As a former police officer, as a black man who has 2 young sons, I struggle with this bill.
This is Assemblyman Mike Gibson, a Democrat from Los Angeles.
But I cannot deny, as a black man, the individuals who are dying in our streets. I cannot deny the young men who are not only being killed by police officers, but also being killed by gang members as well. I can deny that. Those are real, vivid images in my mind. And I wore the uniform. I took an oath of office to serve and protect my community. And I did it.
Although Gibson's law enforcement career was brief, his experience shows how hard it would have been for Shirley Weber to advance the original version of her bill as long as police groups were fighting against it. 3 Assembly members are former cops. Another is a police chaplain. Others have brothers and sons in law enforcement and are not going to vote against their interests. Many are former prosecutors, mayors, or city council members who had worked closely with their local police before joining the legislature.
Every man and woman that wear a badge and put on a uniform, when they close that locker room door, that may be their last time. When they kiss their wives or their children, that may be very well their last time. And so I have to make sure I get it right.
Gibson said he'd asked Weber a lot of questions and was convinced that she struck the right balance.
She has brought people together who would not talk before and brokered a compromise. And I understand that some people may not be comfortable with that, but I believe that our work is not finished yet. And I think this is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Mr. Lackey, you are recognized.
I wasn't going to speak, but I felt like that would be a betrayal to this issue. In my entire elected experience, never has a bill consumed my thinking as this has.
Tom Lackey is a former California Highway Patrol officer. He's a Republican from Palmdale who'd voted against the earlier version of Weber's bill when it was in committee.
Because, ladies and gentlemen, someone who was a very big part of my life had to use deadly force. He was shot during the encounter, but from that day, he was never the same individual. He engaged in some destructive coping mechanisms to the point to where he ended up taking his own life. This is a very serious matter, everyone. And this bill still has some things that trouble me, but it's what has brought us together. And we need to have balance, and we need to recognize when we have something that's bringing us together. And I believe that this bill does that, and so it will earn my support. Thank you.
Weber's compromise was going over well with most of her colleagues, even earning bipartisan praise in the overwhelmingly Democratic chamber. One of the few critics was Assemblyman Devin Mathis, a Central Valley Republican and an Army veteran.
As a proud white guy, one of the Okies in the state legislature, I teach my kids the same thing. Respect law enforcement. Don't make any sudden moves. What are we doing as a legislative body to bring that communication, that respect, back to our children so they know, don't fear the officers. They're there to help. We should look to them. We should respect them. And when they pull you over or they tell you to stop, follow their instructions.
At the end of her remarks, Weber referred to that talk and mentioned her 5- and 7-year-old grandsons.
I've made a commitment that I never want to have that conversation with them. Their life is idyllic. They have great friends of all colors. They enjoy life, and they believe at this point that they have just as much right and respect as any other child in this nation, and that should never change. And for them, for Jill and Kadir, I respectfully ask for your aye vote for AB 392.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. And with that, the clerk will open the roll. All members voted, desire to vote. All members voted, desire to vote. All members vote. The clerk will close the roll, tally the vote. Ayes 66, noes 2. That measure passes. Members.
After that momentous vote, the process isn't over. Now the bill must go through the state Senate before Governor Gavin Newsom can sign it into law. Lawmakers may tweak it along the way, though significant changes seem unlikely because the major players have approved this compromise. Here's what the governor told me.
I want to congratulate Shirley Weber on her incredible leadership. I want to thank everybody for working across their differences. That was an important negotiation. I look forward to signing that bill.
Lizzie Buchan, the ACLU lobbyist who's been advocating for the legislation, said that after it's signed,
California will have one of the strongest use of force laws in the nation, if not the strongest use of force law in the nation.
Even with the compromise, Lizzie says the bill still achieves its main goal.
It retains the core elements that we've always had, which is that officers can only use deadly force when it is necessary. And that necessary includes the actions of the officers leading up to the force. That is a critical piece of this bill that is missing from what most, if not all, states have.
The head of the California Police Chiefs Association agreed that this is an important piece of the bill. Ronald Lawrence says it allows the court to consider what happened not just at the moment the officer fired, but the events leading up to it.
I think we'll find that this will cause officers to give those warnings, tell people to stop resisting, put your hands up, put your hands behind your back. I'm a police officer. I do not want to use force. Please cooperate. We do those things now, but that gets codified in AB 392 now. That really encourages officers to take those de-escalation tactics and put them at the front end.
If the bill becomes law, authorities will evaluate the officer's conduct to decide whether a shooting is justified, and the civilians too.
So if the subject is acting irrational, if they're attacking the officer, if they're being challenging, if they're threatening the officer, whatever their behavior is, those become a totality of the circumstances as well. And I think that's an important distinction because it all plays into the thought process of a police officer when deciding to use force.
Lizzie, the ACLU lobbyist, and Ron, the police chief, agree on something else about the bill. It may reduce the number of police shootings, but it is not going to stop them.
AB 392 or any law that we pass, it's not going to eliminate deadly force. And it has nothing to do with the police. It has to do with we have dangerous people in our society that want to do bad things.
I called Lori Valdez to see how she felt about the compromise. She's the San Jose mother who'd risen before dawn for trips to lobby in Sacramento for the original version of the bill. Over and over, she'd told lawmakers the story of police shooting her partner, Antonio Guzman Lopez.
It's a weaker bill than what I wanted, and I can't support it anymore. I mean, I feel like I'm frustrated because it took a toll on me having to speak about it so much.
Even though the amendments caused Lori to stop backing the bill, they did not change her opinion of Shirley Weber.
I'm not upset with her because she didn't have the say, really. It was the people who didn't back her up. The ones I'm disappointed is all the rest of them who didn't support her at first and jumped on it after. They should be ashamed of themselves because we seen that they weren't going to budge until it got changed.
Melina Abdullah, a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, also felt frustrated by how much clout police groups have in Sacramento.
They kind of have a lock on legislators, and legislators are afraid of them. You know, when we started counting, well, who can we count on to vote for this bill? There was an unwillingness even by a Democratic legislature to do anything that police associations oppose.
Melina is hoping California will strengthen the standard in the future, but she thinks it's unlikely.
I don't know how we're ever going to get meaningful police accountability legislation passed when the police associations themselves are the ones that are kind of seen as having to sign off.
I also called Cephas Johnson and learned that he frames the compromise differently. He's the uncle of Oscar Grant, whose death in 2009 helped spark the movement that resulted in this bill. Grant was unarmed and lying on his belly when a transit officer in Oakland shot him in the back. Since then, Cephas has worked a lot for police reform.
Compromising that takes place is part of the political process. You know, you can't get around that. You know, that's just a simple fact. And once you understand that, then you know what you can shave off and make it seem like you're giving away the vote, but yet you're not giving away really nothing.
Cephas remains 100% behind the bill and calls it a historic accomplishment that would not have happened without Shirley Weber leading the charge.
Her most important characteristic that I felt was that she loved people. She loved justice. She loved doing what she can to bring equality. So I have nothing but admiration and praise for her of staying the course and doing all that she could to make it happen.
We want to tell you about another criminal justice podcast called 70 Million. It examines reforms cities and states are trying, like eliminating cash bail and overturning wrongful convictions. One episode focuses on a program in California that's trying to keep foster youth out of jail. And the podcast is open source. That's great for teachers, organizers, and community media makers because it means you can use and share all the original resources on the 70 Million website for free. 70 Million is produced by Lantigua Williams and Company and funded by the MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge. Season 2 premieres July 15th. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
And they used to have a shed.
Shirley Weber was born Shirley Ann Nash on a farm in Arkansas.
That's a smokehouse. They had a smokehouse in the back. But you would come out of that back door and you'd just be swamped with chickens. Oh, my God. We had so many chickens and cows. And
This is a recording my former colleague Jessica Califati made in 2017 when she visited Arkansas while working on an article about Weber. The Assemblywoman showed Jessica around her family property where aunts and uncles also had homes. Weber was one of 8 siblings. Her parents did not have indoor plumbing when she was born in 1948, but one of her aunts did.
My dad and they all lived in these 3 houses. And so when we came home, we generally stayed here, and down there, all 3, because we'd be in different homes staying. I usually stayed over here because they had running water and a flushing toilet. You know, that was a requirement for me as a kid. In California, it's like, no.
When she was 3 years old, Weber's branch of the family left Arkansas, but every few years they went back to visit. Their experiences in the Jim Crow South shaped who she would become.
If you look at your past, you realize that your present and the future was really determined by that. A lot of things that consistently motivate me to do stuff is probably as a result of this.
Weber's father grew cotton. One day after harvesting his crops, he got into an argument with a white farmer. During an interview in Weber's Capitol office, she told me more about it.
I understand he'd gone to a weigh station that day. And the weigh station tried to cheat him, which wasn't uncommon, that they would say you didn't pick as much cotton as you said you had picked or whatever it was. And so my father got in a confrontation with this guy. There's always a tension at the way station to make sure that you never get to a point of independence. And the whole sharecropping system, when you read the history of it, most of the young men leave the South because if they stay, they'll be forever in poverty.
That's basically what happened with Weber's father, except he left fearing for his life.
The fight took place, and they had decided that they would make an example of my dad. So that was the word out in the community, that they were going to come and obviously either beat him up or lynch him or whatever, but they were going to make an example because you can't have African Americans being independent in 1951. My dad's brothers that night by wagon took him out of Arkansas quietly and took him to Texarkana.
Her father made his way to Los Angeles, got a job in a steel mill, and eventually the rest of the family joined him there.
My parents, clearly found that Los Angeles was far more liberating because you were not confronted with the people who oppressed you every day, living on top of you, basically. And there were opportunities, and there was a sense that there was some fairness.
The family lived in public housing and did not have much money.
I had no idea that I was poor because I had everything I thought I needed, which was the comfort of my family, my parents, my grandmother, and all those things that help you grow and develop, and, never felt I had any real limitations with regards to being able to accomplish things if I just simply worked hard. And my parents, I think, did a job of protecting us in many ways from the harshness of the world.
The harshness of the world seeped in, though, in 1965, when Weber's neighborhood erupted in riots. A white highway patrol officer had stopped 2 black men for reckless driving. They started fighting, and what began as a street corner scuffle blew up into 6 days of violence, with African Americans angry over what they saw as a pattern of police brutality. In the end, the unrest injured more than 1,000 people and killed 34.
The Watts riots was pretty much on my block. I had never seen anything like that before in my life. To see so many police, to see National Guards, to see buildings burning on my block, see people running down the street with police chasing them, to see folks looting stores and stuff like that. It was really bizarre. So we basically stayed inside. We had a huge porch. Sometimes during the daytime you sit down and watch this stuff. But at night you had a curfew. Everybody had to be in the house at a certain time.
Weber was a good student, and her parents were determined that she would go to college. In this recording from a San Diego State University oral history, she talked about how important education was to her father.
By then in the South, that was all they felt a big black guy needed was a 6th grade education. Anything more would be dangerous. And so he was never allowed to go past the 6th grade. And so he had a commitment that every kid he had was going to graduate from high school.
She went to UCLA and quickly became aware that she was one of very few black students there.
And you're conscious of the fact that you really represent what these people think of black people, and which is a tremendous burden to bear, that you are the representative, because there's not enough of you to say, well, black people come in all shapes, sizes, and all intellect. It's not enough of you to do that. So whatever you do is what black people do.
She became interested in Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born activist who led the Black nationalist movement in the early 1900s. And eventually, she wrote her PhD dissertation about him.
And of course, by then, I was sporting a big afro, which most folks thought I had become really out of my mind. They thought I was such a nice girl before I got an afro.
After she graduated, Weber was recruited to join the faculty at San Diego State and help develop its Africana Studies department. She was a young professor, just 23 years old, and students put her to the test.
And so these guys come to me once, and they figured, this is a little kid from L.A. She's probably been in school her whole life, very naive. So they come in, and so this guy sits down, and he's going to tell me what's going to happen in my class. He says, we don't plan to come to class, but we also plan to get A's. So I'm looking at this nut, and I said, obviously, you don't understand the nature of this game. I said, there's only one person directing the rules in this class, and I'm that person. So you either play by the game or you don't join this game at all.
The young professor was dating Daniel Weber, who she'd met while they were students at UCLA. They married in 1973. He became a lawyer and eventually a judge. In the 1970s, he helped create a statewide association for Black lawyers with Willie Brown, the former mayor of San Francisco and longtime Speaker of the State Assembly, told me about working with Weber's husband when I talked with him at a reception in Sacramento.
there were a collection of us who decided that the bar associations generally did not necessarily represent black lawyers. And so from San Diego, Los Angeles, Sacramento, Oakland, and San Francisco, we put together what has become a significant legal operation in the state of California, where we not only advocate on behalf of the black community from a justice standpoint, but we encourage and assist young blacks who want to go into the world of law.
As leader of the San Diego chapter of the NAACP, Weber's husband spoke out about police misconduct in the black community and pushed to create a civilian review board. He died in 2002, but Willie Brown has remained friends with Shirley Weber through the decades.
I think she offers the opportunity for quality, experienced leadership on every issue. She is a real student, she's well-informed, and she reads a lot. And that makes a hell of a difference in this crazy business.
Tony Atkins, now the leader of the state Senate, remembers meeting Weber some 30 years ago.
I first heard Shirley speak when I was 24 years old, and she was a school board member at a luncheon for women. This was a African-American woman wearing a pink suit who stood her ground. You could see her substance. You could hear it in her voice. She just blew me away.
They stayed in touch over the years. As Weber was preparing to retire after 40 years as a professor, a San Diego assembly seat opened up. Atkins invited her to tea and asked her to run.
And she looked at me, and she didn't talk to me for a month. She's like, I thought you were my friend. And I'm like, well, the state needs you. She had experience in education. She was a woman who spoke her mind. And I felt, if we're really going to be for expanded diversity and including all voices, then you got to work to make it happen. It doesn't just happen.
Eventually, Weber called Atkins back.
She said, I'm in. Help me. Tell me what to do.
Weber was concluding her second year in the assembly when an officer killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, sparking the Black Lives Matter movement and national attention on police use of force. She soon wrote 2 bills that challenged the police. One that would have created statewide standards for police to use body cameras stalled early in the legislative process. The other, meant to curb racial profiling by requiring police to collect demographic data on the people they stop, made it to the governor's desk.
We had a vigil that occurred for 24 hours for 3 weeks.
Weber told this story in 2016 when she delivered a graduation speech at UC Berkeley.
We forced the governor to sign this bill because this is a just bill, and I am the person who needs to carry this bill because I've never forgot from whence I've come. And I want to hold fast to the dreams that I had about changing California.
Weber and her husband had 2 children, a daughter and a son. Weber remembers her husband schooling their son about how to behave if he was ever stopped by the police. And he put the lessons to use.
Shortly after my husband died, my son was riding with a friend in his dad's car, and they stopped him, put him on the curb, he and his friend, went through the whole car, went through everything in the car. While he sat there on the curb, he was absolutely humiliated. And when they finished all of that, then they said to him, we might have to put you on the gang list. And my son said, for what? Well, for your own protection. So my son immediately came home in tears almost. And the first thing he said was, I wish my dad was here because he told me da-da-da-da-da. And I said, well, your dad is gone, but your mom is here. And rest assured, tomorrow morning, the chief of police will hear from me. Okay?
Weber said the police also stopped her son several times on the campus where she worked.
And they would go through his car, sit him on the curb in the middle of the morning, the day, and go through all of his stuff and all that stuff. And then they'd eventually go to the glove compartment and realize, oh, this truck is registered to Shirley Weber. He said, yes, my mother, Dr. Weber, who's chair of Africana Studies. And immediately everybody would get nervous because they knew I was going to call the police in the morning for the campus and say, why are you still stopping my son? And when you haven't stopped anybody else, he wasn't driving fast, he didn't run a light, he was just coming out of the gym exercising, and you stop him.
The same day Weber and I talked about this, I had a shockingly similar conversation with Senator Ana Caballero. Shocking because she is working closely with law enforcement, carrying the bill they initially proposed as an alternative to Weber's. It also surprised me because as politicians, Caballero and Weber are very different. They are both Democrats, but Weber is a radical firebrand who represents a solidly Democratic district. And Caballero, she's a moderate centrist, a former mayor of Salinas whose run for state senate flipped a swing district from red to blue. Yet as mothers, they had similar stories about helping their sons navigate encounters with the police.
So when they were growing up, did you ever have the experience of sort of having to talk to them about how to conduct themselves if they're stopped by the police?
Absolutely. Had it a number of times. It's a difficult conversation to have because as a woman of color, you have to tell your boys, I don't care what's going on. You're gonna follow the instructions and you're gonna do exactly what they say, because they're not gonna know you and they're gonna see you as a Mexican kid.
Did they get stopped by the police?
They did.
In ways you felt were unfair?
Yes. Part of the challenge was in many ways they lived a privileged life because people knew they were the mayor's sons, right? But kids will take risks that they shouldn't take. And so I at the times when they were getting stopped, I wasn't happy with what they were doing. But I also felt like the way they were treated was unfair.
So was there ever a time when you, as the mayor, had to tell the police chief that their officers had wrongfully stopped your children, or?
And I did have conversations, but it was not to complain. It was just to really have the chief understand that I was concerned that if my boys were being treated like that other kids were being treated like that as well. And I was concerned because I want the police to be treated with respect. They have the right to stop people and they have the right to ask questions, but they should do it in a way that's respectful. And they'll get back respect as well. And that's really critically important to keep everybody safe.
Is there a racism problem in our police system?
Well, I think there's a racism problem in our society in general. And the police forces are no different than the rest of society. So part of what my bill requires is an understanding of bias, explicit and implicit bias. And we have biases. And that the more that we can understand how those biases operate and how we make snap decisions about people and then take actions based on it, the more we can, I think, be better people, period, and do our jobs better.
Caballero's bill gained unanimous support in the Senate after she stripped it down to focus on training and police department policies. Senate Bill 230 would train officers to de-escalate situations and require that police departments maintain stricter policies about the use of force. It's now moving ahead as a companion measure to Weber's bill. Numerous studies have shown that police are more likely to kill African Americans than white Americans in relation to their numbers in the overall population. Our own analysis of California Department of Justice data shows the disproportionate toll on people of color. 63% of the people California police shot dead in 2017 were African American or Latino, even though those two groups together make up 46% of the state's population. Ronald Lawrence maintains that's not because police are racist.
Well, I think you have to look at where the crime's occurring. I think you have to look at what led up to those shootings. You're going to have officer-involved shootings in communities that have high crime. And fortunately, when an officer goes into a scenario that they're threatened by somebody with a weapon or a gun, there's a high potential that could lead to a deadly force.
The debate over Weber's bill has involved raw conversations about race, with some lawmakers drawing links between modern policing and America's history of slavery. The profession originated in different ways in different parts of the United States. In the North, police forces emerged as cities grew more urbanized, and their elite residents wanted to tamp down social unrest and quell worker riots. In the South, policing began with efforts to control enslaved people, particularly those who had run away. Criminologists and historians have documented that slave patrols, as the first well-organized, government-sponsored forces paid to go on patrol and prevent crime, were essentially the country's first police.
Well, to infer that slavery in the time of slavery has had some influence on how we police and train police officers today is a crazy, wild stretch. I went through the police academy in 1989, and I've never had any training that would suggest that the police are connected to slavery. We hire police officers to protect communities of all colors, and we hire police officers of all colors. We hire people who are empathetic and passionate about keeping criminals away from victims and making sure that we lower our crime rate and keep our communities safe.
Weber and many of the lawmakers who voted for her bill see their effort to reduce police shootings as a matter of racial justice. Chief Lawrence doesn't see it that way.
This law is colorblind. It's talking about reducing use of force and reducing use of officer deadly force, irrespective of somebody's race.
Others in law enforcement say Weber's focus on racial equity shows her bias.
In my view, somebody who has a background that gives them a predilection or a known outcome that they're trying to achieve as opposed to fact gathering and law application should not be the person carrying the legislation forward.
David P. Mastagni is a lawyer for California's largest police officers union.
I see her perspective as entirely flawed. When something happens or a law comes up, I don't take my personal background and what I would hope as a social architect or a policy wonk, I don't hope for or try to make that become the outcome. I look at the law, I look at precedent, and I try to subtract my personal or emotional background from it, and I try to be objective. In many forums, her background could very well be disqualifying for not being able to be objective.
Most people making a decision about this bill seem to be viewing it through the filters of their own experiences. That complicates matters for Assemblyman Evan Lowe, a Democrat who represents Silicon Valley. He's an Asian American millennial gay man who is in many ways pretty progressive, but he often votes against bills by fellow Democrats when it means siding with the police.
Well, I come from a family background with quite a bit of experience within law enforcement. My brother is a police officer in San Jose. Similarly, my stepfather worked in the Department of Corrections as well. This is family business.
Lowe and his brother share a condo. Every time he leaves home for a shift, Lowe wonders if his brother will make it back.
When I wake up, I make sure that I check, is he home? But I also have a niece who is half black. And during all these things, too, she has articulated fear of police officers. That's a very real fear.
When I talked with him about 3 weeks before the assembly voted, Lowe didn't know how he would vote for Weber's bill. He was hoping the sides would reach a compromise.
And it's not one versus the other. It's not Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. No, we're all the same, and we must get this right.
Along with family connections, money may also influence the way some lawmakers vote. Law enforcement unions donate millions of dollars to political campaigns for members of both political parties. It's not the only reason police have clout in the Capitol, but it is part of the equation. I analyzed campaign finance data and found that 91% of current California legislators have received campaign money from law enforcement groups in the last 5 years. In that time, law enforcement unions donated about $4.5 million to California candidates, plus another $3 million to the state Democratic Party, which has complete control of the state capitol. The money helps pay for ads like these.
Given his longtime law enforcement experience, Assemblymember Jim Cooper is the go-to legislator at the state capitol for public safety expertise and support.
My father worked for the U.S. Army. He inspired me to pursue a career in public service. I became a prosecutor and put drug dealers and sex offenders in prison.
As a police chaplain, Grayson helped first responders and crime victims and fought human trafficking. As Assemblyman, Grayson wrote a law to put sexual predators behind bars.
All those spots were for Democratic Assemblymen from different regions of the state: Jim Cooper, Al Maritsucci, and Tim Grayson. In the end, all of them, as well as Evan Lowe, voted for Weber's bill. But the role that law enforcement plays in so many legislators' personal lives, in their public images, and in their campaigns explains why Weber needed to pare back her bill to ensure its passage. And yet, the fact that law enforcement decided to negotiate a compromise rather than stopping the bill in its tracks shows they're adapting to Sacramento's increasingly liberal bent. The ACLU spent more than $1 million lobbying the state capitol in just the first 3 months of 2019. Democrats enjoy their largest majority in modern history, and a new governor is trying to burnish his progressive image. It also shows they see a need to improve their image among many Californians. Though most people in the state say they think their local police treat people of all ethnic groups fairly, polling shows that most African Americans disagree. Weber says that even after the compromise, her bill still represents a major step forward. This is a speech she gave in March, when pastors from around the state converged at the Capitol to lobby for her bill.
And so I stand here as a daughter of a sharecropper who has lived through horrors of racism and the injustices of the judicial system. And after all of that, I have to stand and recognize the fact that things need to change. That my father endured injustices and indignities that my grandchildren should never have to face. That's right. That's right. And so I stand here because of the fact that it is important that we fight back finally. Yeah. AB 392 is just the beginning of so many efforts that we have to begin to bring the kind of justice that is essential for this state, that California, the state of beautiful opportunity. My father came to this golden state because he knew it had opportunities that the South did not have. Yet we cannot continue the practices that are representative of the Jim Crow South by ignoring the fact that there are individuals in this state who are being harassed, but also who are being killed unnecessarily. And so we have to have a new method and a new law that basically changes the use of lethal force in this nation, that respects the lives of everyone else. And all we ask for, all we have ever asked for in this country, is to be treated with dignity, to be treated with fairness, to respect our lives like you respect other people's lives, and give our children and our grandchildren a chance to grow and to develop. We have a long way to go, but we are determined to get there. Thank you so much.
Do you have questions about this podcast or California's attempt to change its use of force law? Please send them to us. I may answer them on a future episode. You can leave a voicemail at 916-209-0249 or send an email to forceoflaw@calmatters.org. You're listening to Force of Law, a production of CalMatters and Studio 2B. I'm your host, Laurel Rosenhall. Brian Howie produced this episode and helped me report it. Cheryl Duvall is our editor. Ray Ortega engineered this episode. Robbie Short is our researcher. David Lesher of CalMatters and Joaquin Alvarado and Kristen Belden of Studio 2B are the executive producers. Thank you to the San Diego State University Oral Histories for letting us use its audio of Shirley Weber. Thanks also to Chloe Behrens and Zach Moreno from Squadcast.